On 29 July 1944, Adolf Hitler personally authorized the Iron Cross for a spy operating inside Britain. 4 months later, the British Crown made the same man a member of the Order of the British Empire. Both decorations went to one Spaniard in a rented house in North London, running an army that did not exist. He is the only agent of the Second World War honored by Hitler and by a British king, and for 35 years after it ended, the world believed he was dead. He was not a soldier. He was not an aristocrat. He was a failed chicken farmer from Barcelona who had never been trained by anybody. And by the summer of 1944, he was the single most trusted intelligence source the German High Command possessed. His name was Juan Pujol García. The Germans called him Arabel. The British called him Garbo after Greta Garbo, because the officer who named him decided he was the best actor in the world, and the strangest thing about the whole affair is that nobody asked him to do it. He volunteered. Then he was turned down, repeatedly. To understand how a man with no training talked his way into the confidence of the Third Reich, you have to start with a country that had just lost its king. The boy in a kingdom that vanished, Juan Pujol García was born in Barcelona on 14 February 1912, into the Spain of Alfonso XIII, a monarchy that had reigned since the Reconquista in one form or another, and that carried itself as though it always would. His father ran a factory. The family was comfortable. He was educated by the Marist brothers at a boarding school in Mataró and then in Barcelona, and he was, by every account including his own, an unremarkable student. In 1931, at 19, he completed 6 months of compulsory military service in a light artillery regiment. That same year, the kingdom he had been born into stopped existing. On 12 April 1931, Spain held municipal elections. They were not a referendum on the monarchy. They were local council seats. But the Republican Party swept the major cities, and within 48 hours the arithmetic of the streets had overtaken the arithmetic of the ballot. On 14 April, Alfonso XIII left the country. He did not abdicate. He issued a statement saying he was suspending the exercise of royal power rather than provoke a civil war, and he drove to Cartagena and boarded a ship for Marseille. He would never set foot in Spain again. He formally renounced his rights in January 1941 and died in Rome the following month, in a hotel, in a city ruled by Mussolini. This is the detail worth holding on to, because it explains something about the man this story is about. Juan Pujol came of age watching an institution that everyone assumed was permanent evaporate in under 2 days. He watched a king become a private citizen in a hotel suite. And he learned very early and very cheaply a lesson that most people never learn at all. That authority is a performance, and that if the performance is convincing enough, almost nobody checks what is behind it. He would spend the war proving it. The republic that replaced the king lasted 5 years before it tore itself apart. In July 1936, when the Spanish Civil War began, Pujol was managing a poultry farm north of Barcelona. He had no interest in either side. That did not matter. Both sides came for him anyway. He was conscripted by the Republicans. He hid. He was caught. He was imprisoned. He got out. He was put back into uniform. And in September 1938, during the Battle of the Ebro, the bloodiest engagement of the entire war, he crossed the lines and deserted to the nationalists. By his own later account, he never fired a bullet for either side. He had seen 2 political religions up close now, and he had concluded that both were built on the same thing, men who believed what they were told because it arrived in the correct format, stamped by the correct office, spoken in the correct voice. In Burgos, after the war, he met a woman named Araceli González. They married in Madrid, and in 1940, with Europe collapsing and the Wehrmacht in Paris, Juan Pujol García, a man with no military rank, no intelligence background, no contacts, and no English, decided he was going to do something about Adolf Hitler, rejected 3 times. In January 1941, he walked into the British embassy in Madrid and offered himself as a spy. They said no. He went back. He sent his wife. He tried a different door and a different official, 3 separate approaches, 3 refusals. From the British point of view, this was not unreasonable. Madrid in 1941 was saturated with walk-ins, chancers and Abwehr provocations, and a Catalan poultry manager with no access to anything was exactly what a German plant would look like. So he made a decision that almost nobody in the history of espionage has made, before or since. If the British would not employ him against the Germans, he would get the Germans to employ him, and then he would hand himself to the British as a going concern. He needed a cover identity, and he built one out of nothing but nerve. He talked a printer into producing what looked like a Spanish diplomatic passport. He constructed a persona, a fanatically pro-Nazi official of the Spanish government, well-connected, ideologically committed, and, crucially, about to be posted to London on official business. Then he approached the Abwehr in Madrid and offered to spy on Britain for Germany. His case officer was a German agent operating under the name Friedrich Nappe-Rete, and Frederico bought it. Completely, Pujol was given a crash course in tradecraft, a bottle of secret ink, a code book, a set of cover addresses in Lisbon, and roughly £600 in expenses. His instructions were to travel to Britain and recruit a network of sub-agents. He did not travel to Britain. He went to Lisbon, the England that existed only on paper. Here's where the story becomes almost unbelievable, and where you have to keep reminding yourself that this is the documented record, not a screenplay. For roughly a year, Juan Pujol García reported to German intelligence on conditions inside the United Kingdom, troop movements, convoy departures, morale, industry, defenses from a hotel room in Portugal. He had never been to Britain in his life. His sources were these: a tourist guidebook to England, a railway timetable, newsreels shown in Lisbon cinemas, advertisements and reference books in the public library, and an imagination that turned out to be one of the most dangerous weapons of the Second World War. He was working out of Estoril, the seaside strip west of Lisbon, where neutral Portugal had become the last open door in Europe, a place of casinos, embassies, refugees, and deposed royalty living out of steamer trunks. And that word royalty matters because of what had happened on that same coastline the summer before. The king they treated to take first in July 1940, a British duke, arrived in Lisbon. He was not merely a duke. 4 years earlier, he had been Edward VIII, King of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India, and he had given up the throne to Mary Wallace Simpson. He had visited Germany in 1937 and been received by Hitler personally. And now, having fled France ahead of the German advance, he and the Duchess were sitting in neutral Portugal, first at the British Embassy, and from 11 July at a villa near Cascais, belonging to the banker Ricardo Espirito Santo Silva. Berlin saw an opportunity, and Joachim von Ribbentrop persuaded Hitler that the Duke of Windsor's abdication had been driven by sympathies the Reich could use. The operation was codenamed Willy. Walter Schellenberg of the SD was sent to run it. The plan, in its various drafts, ranged from persuading the Duke to remain in Europe as a negotiating asset, to positioning him as a restored monarch after a German invasion of Britain, to, if persuasion failed, removing him from Portugal by force. A Spanish intermediary, Miguel Primo de Rivera, met the Duke twice in mid-July and floated the idea of a hunting trip across the Spanish border. The Duke did not go. On 1 August 1940, he and the Duchess sailed from Lisbon aboard the Excalibur to take up the governorship of the Bahamas, and Operation Willy collapsed. Hold that in your mind, because the contrast is the whole point of this story. Germany spent an enormous amount of effort, money and senior personnel trying to acquire one former king on that coastline, and got nothing. 18 months later, on the same stretch of coast, a Catalan chicken farmer with a fake passport walked into their intelligence service uninvited and was handed a codebook, a budget, and the confidence of the German High Command. They chased the crown, they were captured by the commoner. The mistakes that saved him. Pujol's reports from Lisbon were not flawless. They were, in places, absurd. He worked in metric measurements and had to convert currency he had never handled. He described dock workers in Glasgow who, he said, would do anything for a litre of wine, a sentence that describes a Mediterranean port and no city in Scotland that has ever existed. He invented expenses on a scale that suggested a country with different distances than the real one. None of it was caught. And this is the part that tells you something about how large organizations actually fail. The Abwehr did not check him because the reports were arriving in the correct format. From an agent they had recruited themselves, whose ideological credentials they had verified, and whose material confirmed what Berlin already believed. He was not defeating German intelligence, he was cooperating with its assumptions. The people who did notice were the British, and they had no idea who they were noticing because the traffic between Madrid, Lisbon, and Berlin was being read at Bletchley Park. London was watching an entirely fictitious spy network operate inside its own country, and could not account for a single member of it. Somewhere in Britain, according to the German traffic, was a well-organized, productive, high-volume ring reporting to the Abwehr, and MI5, which had by then identified or turned essentially every German agent in the country, could not find it. Then came the convoy. Pujol reported the sailing of a convoy from Liverpool to Malta. The convoy did not exist, but the Germans believed it and acted on it, and British forces watched the Kriegsmarine and its allies expend efforts searching for ships that had never left port. Resources were burned, chasing a shadow invented by a man in a Portuguese hotel room. At that point, the hunt in London stopped being a curiosity and became urgent. Whoever this agent was, he was not merely useless to the Germans, He was actively costing them. The connection was finally made in February 1942, when either Pujol or his wife approached the American Naval Attaché's office in Lisbon and spoke to a U.S. Navy lieutenant named Patrick de Morest. The Americans passed it to the British. The British compared the story to the mystery traffic they had been reading for a year. The Phantom Network and the volunteer they had turned away 3 times were the same man. On the 24th of April 1942, Juan Pujol García was brought to Britain. 27 people who were never born. He was given a code name. The first one was Bovril. It did not last. The officer Cyril Mills proposed something better, Garbo, because in Mills's judgment this man was the best actor in the world. The name stuck, and Pujol was handed to the MI5 case officer who would shape the rest of the war, Tomás Harris. Harris was half Spanish, an art dealer by profession, fluent, cultured, and this is the essential part, capable of writing fiction at industrial scale in a language and a voice that was not his own. Together, in a house in North London, they took the network Pujol had improvised in Lisbon and turned it into an institution. By the end, it consisted of 27 agents. Not one of them existed. There was a Portuguese commercial traveler in Wales. There was a Venezuelan student in Glasgow. There were Welsh nationalists, disgruntled officials, an Indian poet, a wealthy Anglophobe, secretaries, clerks, and men with access to ports and airfields, a cross-section of British society assembled entirely out of paper, each with a personality, a temperament, a set of grievances, a distinctive writing style, and a rate of pay. The correspondence alone ran to more than 300 letters, averaging around 2,000 words each, written in secret ink between innocuous cover text and posted to accommodation addresses in Lisbon. And the network had to be maintained with the same care as a real one, because a real network has failures, and a network that never fails is a network that is being run by the other side, which brings us to the death of William Gerbers. Gerbers was Pujol's agent in Liverpool. He was obviously imaginary, but a major British fleet movement had taken place out of Liverpool, and Berlin had not been warned about it, and an agent in Liverpool who fails to notice a fleet leaving Liverpool is an agent who invites questions. So Gerbers fell ill. He had been taken seriously ill just before the sailing, Pujol reported. That was why the warning never came, and then because a convenient illness at a convenient moment is still a coincidence, Gerbers died. To close the loop, a death notice was placed in a Liverpool newspaper and forwarded to the Germans as confirmation. Berlin accepted the loss with regret, and then began paying a pension to the grieving widow of a man who had never been born. That money went to the British Treasury, so did the rest of it. Over the course of the war, the Germans paid out something on the order of $340,000 to fund the salaries, expenses, and travel of Pujol's imaginary staff. The Third Reich did not merely believe in the network, it financed it. By August 1943, the volume of traffic had outgrown the postal system, so Pujol introduced a new character, an agent with radio expertise, willing to transmit on the network's behalf. From that point, the reports went out by wireless, and the tempo increased enormously. Everything up to here was rehearsal, all of it, the invented staff, the manufactured funeral, the years of accumulated credibility, existed to buy the Germans' trust for a single week in June 1944. The army that was not there. In January 1944, Berlin gave Pujol his standing orders for the year. They wanted to know where the Allies would land. Every serious German officer knew an invasion was coming. The question was the beach. And the Allied deception plan, Operation Fortitude, was built to make sure they answered that question wrong. And, more importantly, kept answering it wrong after they had been proved wrong. The centerpiece was the 1st United States Army Group. FUSAG existed on paper as roughly 11 divisions and around 150,000 men, poised in southeast England, aimed directly at the Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing, the obvious crossing, the one German planners already expected. It was given a commander whose reputation made it credible, General George Patton. FUSAG had radio traffic. It had insignia. It had a headquarters. It had no soldiers. And the man whose job it was to confirm its existence to Berlin was Juan Pujol García, whose reporting Berlin had been checking against reality for 2 years and finding correct. Between January and June 1944, he sent more than 500 radio messages, on some days more than 20. His agents reported unit sightings, shoulder flashes, rail movements, sealed camps, and troop concentrations in exactly the places FUSAG was supposed to be. Then came the actual invasion, and the most audacious move of the entire operation. In the early hours of 6 June 1944, with the Normandy landings already underway, Pujol was allowed to warn the Germans. At 3 in the morning, he came up on a pre-arranged schedule to pass an urgent alert. An invasion was in progress. The timing had been calculated with brutal precision, early enough that Garbo could later prove he had warned them, late enough that the warning could change nothing on the beaches, and then the war handed him a gift no deception planner could have engineered. The German station did not answer. Nobody was listening at 3 a.m. Contact was not made until 8 o'clock, by which time the landings were public knowledge, and Pujol was able to fold in additional detail, accurate, verifiable, and utterly worthless militarily. From the German side, the picture was devastatingly persuasive. Their best agent in Britain had tried to warn them of the invasion hours in advance, and their own operator had missed it. His credibility did not survive D-Day. It was multiplied by it. The message that held the line. Everything so far was set up for the message sent on 9th June 1944, 3 days after the landings, with the Allied beachhead still narrow and fragile, and German armor beginning to move toward Normandy. Pujol transmitted an assessment to the German High Command. He reported that his network's collated figures showed a very large concentration of Allied divisions still in Britain, a number well above the true total. He pointed out that the formations of Fusag had not appeared in Normandy at all, and he drew the conclusion the Allies desperately needed Berlin to draw, that Normandy was a large-scale diversion designed to pull German reserves out of position, and that the real blow was still to come at the Pas de Calais. The message went to the highest level, and the German command did what he suggested. Armored and infantry formations that could have been thrown at the Normandy beachhead in its most vulnerable days were held in the Pas de Calais, waiting for a second landing that was never coming. Field Marshal von Rundstedt declined to release them to Rommel. Through July and August, a substantial force on the order of 2 armored divisions and 19 infantry divisions remained in the wrong place. By the end of June, there were more German troops sitting in the Pas de Calais than there had been on the day of the invasion. Post-war analysis found that dozens of Pujol's reports had been folded directly into German high command intelligence summaries. Berlin's own assessment, sent days after the landings, was that everything received from his network in the previous week had been confirmed without exception. They were checking his work against reality and concluding that reality agreed with him. The Iron Cross and the Order of the British Empire. On 29 July 1944, the German government awarded Juan Pujol García the Iron Cross, second class. It was not a decoration normally available to a foreign civilian agent. It was a combat award, and granting it required authorization from the top of the Reich. Hitler approved it. The medal could not be pinned on for obvious reasons, so the award was conveyed to him by radio, a ceremony conducted entirely in Morse code, honoring a man for services rendered to a country he had spent 3 years systematically deceiving. He was still working. That summer, the V-1 flying bombs were falling on London, and Berlin wanted impact reports, where they landed, what they hit, how many died. It was the most dangerous assignment of his career, because the Germans could correct their aim with accurate data, and inaccurate data from a trusted agent risked exposing the entire network the moment it was cross-checked. Harris solved it with theater. Pujol was arrested, a fabricated detention that explained his sudden silence at exactly the moment reporting became impossible. When he resurfaced days later, he did so with an official-looking apology for wrongful detention, which he forwarded to his German handlers as further proof of his standing and his risk. The Germans did not merely accept it, they worried about him. In the closing weeks of 1944, the British recognized him too. Juan Pujol García was made a member of the Order of the British Empire. Consider the arithmetic of that year. A Spanish civilian, decorated by Adolf Hitler in July and honored by the British crown in the winter, by the state of a king whose own brother had given up the throne 8 years earlier, and been hunted through Portugal by the same regime that had just given Pujol its Iron Cross. 2 of the great antagonists of the 20th century, decorating the same man for the same work, in the same year, only one of them knew what the work actually was. The man who died in Angola. When the war ended, Pujol was not celebrated. He could not be. The double-cross system was among the most closely held secrets Britain possessed, and its value did not end in 1945. And Pujol had a specific and reasonable fear. He had spent 3 years at the center of German intelligence. Thousands of former Reich officials had scattered across Europe and South America, some of them men who had personally handled his case, all of them capable of working out what he had done. He did not believe a quiet retirement in Europe would be survivable. So, with British assistance, he arranged the last deception of his career. In 1949, Juan Pujol García died of malaria in Angola. There was documentation. The story circulated. His former life closed behind him. The man himself went to Venezuela, to the oil town of Lagunillas, where he ran a bookshop and later a gift shop. He remarried. He raised a second family. He became, in the most complete sense available, nobody. For 35 years, the man who had helped hold 19 German divisions in the wrong province of France sold books to strangers who had never heard his name. The Prince and the Dead Man. The record was reopened by a British researcher and politician, Rupert Allison, who wrote on intelligence history under the name Nigel West. He had been picking at the Garbo case since the early 1970s. The problem was elementary and total. Everyone who knew the story knew it under a code name. Former officers remembered a Spaniard. Some remembered a first name. Nobody would produce the rest, and the file was closed. In March 1984, a former MI5 officer finally gave him the full name. On the 20th of May 1984, in New Orleans, Rupert Allison met Juan Pujol García, 72 years old, alive, and officially dead for 35 years. Allison persuaded him to come to London. What happened there is the part of the story that stays with people. Pujol was taken to the Special Forces Club and reunited with the officers who had run the double-cross system, men who in several cases had genuinely believed him dead for decades. And he was received at Buckingham Palace for a private audience with Prince Philip. There is a symmetry in that meeting that no scriptwriter would risk. Philip had been born a prince of the Greek royal house on Corfu in 1921 and carried out of the country as an infant when that dynasty fell, a child of one of Europe's discarded thrones who had ended up consort to the British crown. Sitting opposite him was a man who had watched his own king drive away from Spain in 1931 and had spent his life proving that the difference between a real institution and an invented one is often nothing more than the confidence of the person describing it. The exiled prince and the dead spy in a palace discussing a war that had ended 40 years earlier. Then, on 6th of June 1984, the 40th anniversary of the landings, Juan Pujol García went to Normandy. He walked the beaches. He visited the cemeteries. He was, by the accounts of those with him, badly shaken. He had spent the war in a house in North London writing letters, and he had never had to look at the ground where the consequences landed. He laid a wreath and he wept. He died in Caracas on 10 October 1988, and he is buried at Coronil on the Venezuelan coast, a very long way from Barcelona. What he actually proved. There is a temptation to file this as a caper, the charming amateur who fooled the Nazis. That version misses the point, and the point is uncomfortable. Juan Pujol García was not a superior intelligence officer. He had no training, no access, and for the first year, no country. What he had was an accurate understanding of how powerful institutions actually make decisions, and that understanding came from watching a monarchy that had lasted centuries dissolve in 48 hours, when the people inside it stopped believing in the performance. He worked out that the Abwehr, the SD, and the German High Command did not verify information so much as receive it. That material arriving in the right format, from a source with the right credentials, saying something the leadership already suspected would be filed and acted upon. That the mechanism was not intelligence at all, but confirmation. And he understood the second half of it, which is rarer. That credibility is an asset you build slowly and spend once. 2 years of accurate reporting, invented illnesses, staged funerals, expense claims, and a fabricated pension existed for one purpose, so that on 9th June 1944 a single message would be believed. There is a final irony worth sitting with. Germany spent 1940 chasing a former king around Portugal because it believed that a man with a crown could deliver a country. It failed. 4 years later, the same intelligence apparatus was taking strategic dictation from an unemployed poultry manager it had recruited by accident and moving armored divisions on his word. The Reich looked for power in the places where power is supposed to live. It never once looked at the man writing the letters. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. To see the fallen king that Berlin actually wanted, the monarch they tried to lure out of Portugal in the summer of 1940, watch our video on the Duke of Windsor and Operation Willy. Please like and subscribe and let us know in the comments which story we should cover next.